The snowstorm was fierce, biting at the skin like knives. The human slave named Kael pulled the heavy sled with all his strength. On the sled sat the alien queen, her body wrapped in furs, her legs unmoving. Her golden eyes watched him without a word, and her expression revealed nothing of her thoughts. Kael had been taken from his world 3 years ago. He had fought in the mines, carried weapons for his masters, and endured hunger. When the war came to this frozen world, he was ordered to follow the retreating troops. But the enemy had struck harder than expected, scattering everyone. Now only he and the queen remained alive in the forest. The queen had been injured. When her hover throne crashed during the ambush, her legs no longer responded, and her guards were gone. Kael had found her lying in the snow, her lips blue from the cold. She had told him in a voice of command to carry her to safety. He had obeyed without question. The trees were tall and dark, their branches heavy with ice. Kael's breath rose in clouds as he struggled forward. He knew the enemy patrols might still be near. One sound, one flash of movement, and they would be hunted again. But he kept moving, the rope cutting into his hands as he pulled the sled. Queen studied him as if trying to understand what kind of creature he was. He was a slave, yet he had not left her behind. He was human, yet his endurance was greater than her trained soldiers. Her mind was sharp, but she could not read his thoughts. It unsettled her. A distant howl echoed through the forest. Kael stopped, scanning the shadows between the trees. The sound did not belong to any human or alien soldier. It was something older, something that lived in these wild lands. The queen's hand tightened on the edge of the sled, her eyes sharp with warning. Kael moved again, faster now, his boots crunching through the snow. Every step was heavy, but his will was harder than the ice beneath him. The queen's fate was in his hands, and he had decided she would not die here. Whatever hunted them would have to go through him first. Far ahead, through the swirling snow, a faint orange light appeared. Kael knew it could be shelter or danger. He gripped the rope tighter, his heart pounding. If it was shelter, they might live another day. If it was danger, he would face it with the queen behind him. Asterisk. The orange glow flickered between the trees, swaying as if from a fire. Kael kept pulling the sled, his eyes narrowing against the wind. The queen shifted slightly, under her furs, watching the light with an unreadable gaze. Neither spoke, but both knew they could be walking toward either safety or death. The snow beneath Kael's boots grew softer as he approached the light. He slowed his steps, listening for voices. The forest was strangely quiet, except for the crunch of snow and the soft hiss of the wind. The glow grew brighter until it lit the edges of the tree trunks ahead. A small camp appeared in a clearing. A fire burned low in the center, surrounded by rough shelters made of hides and wood. Shapes moved near the flames, not soldiers but tall, fur-covered hunters with sharp weapons in their hands. Their eyes reflected the firelight like predators in the night. Kael stopped in the shadows, his body tense. The queen's voice came low and steady, telling him these were not all eyes. She called them ice stalkers, nomads who hunted both beasts and people. If they saw her, they would take her as a prize, and Kael would not live to see the morning. The hunters sniffed the air as if they could smell strangers. One of them turned its head toward the trees where Kael stood. Kael's grip tightened on the rope, his mind racing. He could try to go around the camp, but the snow was deep, and the sled would leave a clear trail. They had to act fast, the queen's golden eyes met his, and for the first time there was no command in them, only trust. Kael nodded and began pulling the sled backward, his steps slow to avoid noise. The wind carried the sound of the fire and the murmur of the hunters' voices, but he could hear their movement growing closer. A sudden crack of ice underfoot betrayed them. One hunter barked a short cry, and the others turned toward the sound. Kael didn't wait. He pulled hard on the sled and broke into a run, snow spraying behind him. The queen clutched the sled's sides. Her eyes fixed on the dark forest ahead, the hunters gave chase, their heavy footsteps pounding through the snow. Kael's lungs burned, but he pushed harder, weaving between trees to break their line of sight. Arrows hissed past, striking the snow with dull thuds. The queen's voice rose, giving him directions toward a hidden path she remembered from her youth. They reached a narrow ravine where the snow was thinner. Kael leaped down the slope, dragging the sled after him. The hunters followed but slipped on the icy ground, buying Kael precious seconds. He kept running until the sound of pursuit faded into the howling wind. When they finally stopped, Kael bent over, gasping for air. The queen's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, a rare gesture of gratitude. She told him the path they were on would lead to an abandoned outpost from the old wars. If it still stood, they could find shelter and maybe supplies. The ravine. Walls rose steeply on both sides, sheltering them from the worst of the wind. The snow here was untouched, and the silence felt heavier. Kael pulled the sled forward, his muscles aching, but the thought of safety pushed him on. The queen watched him quietly, her eyes softer now. They traveled for hours until the ravine widened into a frozen plain. In the distance, Kael saw the dark shape of a structure half buried in snow. It looked ancient, its walls leaning but still standing against the cold. Smoke no longer rose from it, but it was the first sign of shelter. They had seen. Kael moved toward the building with caution, scanning for movement. The queen straightened slightly on the sled, her gaze fixed on the structure. She said it was once a listening post for her people during the last Great War. If the stores inside had not been looted, they might survive here. The wind shifted, and Kael caught the faint scent of something burning. His grip tightened on the rope. If someone was inside, they were not alone. He looked at the queen, and she gave a single nod, her eyes cold but resolute. Whatever awaited them inside would decide their fate. The outpost loomed ahead, its walls cracked and covered in frost. Kael slowed his steps, his breath steaming in the cold air. The queen adjusted her furs and straightened her back, her golden eyes locked on the entrance. Both of them knew that shelter could mean safety or a trap. Kael approached the door, his boots crunching in the snow. The heavy metal frame was bent, and the locking mechanism had been forced open long ago. He stepped to the side and listened. The wind howled behind them, but from inside came the faint sound of movement. Someone was there. He placed the sled in the shadow of the wall and whispered for the queen to stay still. Her eyes narrowed at the order, but she did not argue. Kael drew the short blade he had taken from a fallen soldier and moved inside. The corridor was dark, smelling faintly of smoke and old metal. His footsteps echoed on the frozen floor. Ahead, a dim light flickered from a room at the end of the hallway. Kael pressed himself to the wall and peered inside. A small fire burned in a makeshift pit, and a single figure sat beside it, wrapped in ragged cloth. The figure's head turned sharply toward him. It was a young alien, not much older than a child, with pale skin and wide silver eyes. The child's hands clutched a long spear that shook in their grasp. Kael stepped forward slowly, raising one hand to show he meant no harm. The child's gaze darted past him toward the doorway. The queen's voice called softly from outside, asking what he had found. Kael told her to wait, but the sound of her voice made the child's expression change. They lowered the spear slightly and whispered a word Kael did not understand. It was repeated again, this time louder, and the queen gasped. The word was a title, one that belonged to the queen before the war. The child ran past Kael, into the snow, and fell to their knees before her. Kael followed, blade still in hand, and watched as the queen spoke in her own language. The child's eyes filled with tears. The queen explained that the child was the last survivor of the outpost's crew. They had stayed hidden for weeks, living on frozen rations and melted snow. She told Kael they would take the child with them. Her voice was calm, but he could see something stirring behind her eyes. They moved inside together, bringing the sled near the fire. The heat was weak, but it took the edge off the cold. Kael searched the outpost for anything useful, finding old blankets, sealed food packs, and a cracked water container. The queen and the child spoke quietly while he worked. Kael felt the queen's gaze on him as he prepared a small meal from the rations. She was studying him again, the way she had in the forest. When he brought her the food, she thanked him in the human tongue. It was the first time she had ever used his language. They ate in silence while the wind battered the walls outside. The firelight cast shadows across the queen's face, making her look both fierce and fragile. Kael wondered how long she had been carrying the weight of command alone. In that moment, she seemed less like a ruler and more like someone fighting to survive. When the meal was finished, Kael checked the door and blocked it with a broken beam. He laid out blankets for the queen and the child, keeping his blade within reach. The queen's eyes followed his every move, as if she was measuring more than his actions. It was as though she was trying to understand why he still stayed. Child fell asleep quickly, curled beside the queen. Kael took a position near the fire, his back to the wall. Outside, the storm grew worse, the wind screaming through the gaps in the old metal. The queen spoke softly, telling him the enemy would not stop hunting her. Her voice held no fear, only certainty. Kael met her gaze across the fire. He told her that if they came, he would fight. For a moment, the queen said nothing. Then with a faint nod, she answered that perhaps he was more than a slave after all. Asterisk. The storm lasted through the night, rattling the walls of the outpost. Kael barely slept, keeping one hand on his blade and his ears tuned to every sound. The queen rested against the wall with the child beside her, her eyes half closed but still alert. She had the look of someone who had learned to sleep with danger near. By morning, the wind had calmed, leaving the world outside silent and white. Kael stepped out into the snow to scout the area. His boots sank deep, and the cold bit through his clothing. The forest lay still, but tracks in the snow told him they were not alone. Several sets of footprints led toward the outpost from the north. He returned inside and told the queen what he had seen. Her gaze hardened, and she began speaking quickly to the child in her language. The child's eyes widened, and they rushed to gather the few belongings they had. Kael understood without words that they needed to leave before the owners of those tracks arrived. They loaded the sled with supplies from the outpost. Kael secured the blankets and food while the queen wrapped the child in furs. The air was heavy with urgency. Even without seeing the enemy, Kael could feel them closing in. Every instinct told him they had little time left. The path they took led south toward the mountains. The snow here was deeper, but the terrain offered more cover. Kael moved at a steady pace, careful to avoid open ground. The queen watched their surroundings with sharp eyes, her hand resting on a short, curved blade she had taken from the outpost wall. Hours passed before the first sound reached them, a faint, rhythmic thud. Kael stopped, listening. It came. Again, louder this time. The queen's expression tightened. She told him it was a pursuit beast, trained by the enemy to track and kill without mercy. Her voice was calm, but her fingers gripped her weapon. The thud grew into a pounding that shook the snow from tree branches. Kael urged himself forward, pulling the sled faster. The child clung to the queen's arm, their wide eyes darting between the trees. Somewhere behind them, a deep, guttural growl rolled through the air. They reached a narrow pass where jagged rocks jutted from the snow. Kael guided the sled between them, knowing the beast would have to follow. The queen called out, telling him there was a ledge ahead where the path narrowed even more. If they could reach it, they could force the beast into a choke point. The sound of pursuit grew louder. Kael's muscles burned, but he pushed himself harder. Snow sprayed behind him as the sled slid across the icy ground. The growl turned into a roar, and Kael risked a glance back. A massive, fur-covered creature, with bone armor strapped to its head, barreled toward them. They reached the ledge. Kael turned the sled sharply, guiding it to the side while the queen and the child moved quickly to the rock wall. The beast charged straight into the choke point, its massive frame wedged between the stone. It thrashed violently, shaking the ground. Kael seized the moment. He lunged forward and drove his blade deep into the creature's shoulder. The beast roared, snapping its head toward him, but the narrow space kept it from reaching him. The queen's blade flashed as she struck from the other side, her golden eyes blazing. The creature gave one final heave before collapsing in the snow. Its heavy body blocked the pass completely. Kael stepped back, breathing hard, his blade coated in dark blood. The queen looked at him, and for the first time, there was something like respect in her gaze. They did not linger. Kael led them away from the pass, choosing a path that wound deeper into the mountains. The snow fell lightly now, covering their tracks. The queen rode in silence, but her eyes never left him for long. She had begun to see that his loyalty was not born of chains. By nightfall, they found a sheltered hollow between two ridges. Kael built a fire and set their supplies nearby. The queen settled close to the flames with the child, her expression softer in the glow. When Kael sat across from her, she spoke quietly, saying that his place in her service might not be what it once was. The fire crackled softly in the hollow, casting long shadows on the snow. Kael sat with his back to the rock wall, watching the flames and listening to the quiet breathing of the queen and the child. The storm had passed, leaving a cold stillness in its wake. The night felt calm, but Kael knew such calm never lasted. Before dawn, Kael woke to a faint sound beyond the ridge. It was not the wind, nor the shifting of snow. It was the measured tread of boots on frozen ground. He rose silently, his hand on his blade, and stepped to the edge of the hollow to look out. Through the pale light, he saw shapes moving between the rocks. The queen stirred and called to him softly, asking what he saw. Kael told her there were 3, maybe 4 figures approaching from the east. She frowned, then explained that they were not enemy hunters but soldiers of her own people. The child's eyes lit up with hope, but the queen's tone was wary. Kael watched as the soldiers came into view. Their armor was dented from battle, their cloaks tattered, and their weapons ready in hand. When they saw the queen, they dropped to one knee in the snow. One of them called out in their language, his voice carrying pride and relief. Yet Kael noticed their eyes flicker toward him with suspicion. The queen ordered them to rise and come forward. They obeyed, but their steps were slow, and their gazes sharp. One soldier asked why a human slave was at her side, pulling her sled through the wilderness. Another questioned why her guards had fallen while he still lived. Kael stood silent, his hand never leaving his weapon. The queen's voice cut through the cold air, firm and commanding. She told them Kael had saved her life when their own soldiers had failed. She reminded them that without him, she would be dead in the snow. The soldiers exchanged uneasy looks, and one muttered something Kael could not understand. But the queen's glare silenced him. They agreed to escort the queen back to their nearest camp in the mountains. Kael kept his distance as they began to move, pulling the sled once more. The soldiers whispered to each other, their eyes often on him. He could feel their distrust pressing against his back like the point of a blade. As they traveled, Kael noticed the queen speaking quietly to the child. The child's hand gripped hers tightly, as though afraid. The queen's expression was calm, but her eyes betrayed thought and calculation. Kael guessed she knew what he already suspected. The soldiers were not entirely loyal to her cause. Midday, they reached a narrow mountain trail. The wind here was fierce, and the path treacherous. The soldiers moved ahead, forcing Kael and the sled to follow. One of them slowed to walk beside him, speaking in the Queen's language. Kael could not understand the words, but the tone was sharp, almost threatening. The Queen called the soldier forward before Kael could react. Her voice was cold, her orders precise. Whatever the man had intended, he obeyed reluctantly, his eyes narrowing as he stepped away. Kael met the Queen's gaze, and for a moment, he saw not only trust there, but also warning. As the trail bent around a ridge, Kael spotted smoke rising in the distance. The Queen confirmed it was the camp. She spoke to her soldiers with authority, but Kael noticed their pace quicken, as if eager to reach it for reasons beyond safety. The child glanced at him, eyes wide with something like fear. When the camp came into view, Kael saw it was little more than a cluster of tents and a few supply crates. Yet even from this distance, the soldiers standing watch stared at him with open hostility. The Queen gave him a subtle nod, as if to prepare him for what was coming. They entered the camp under many watchful eyes. The Queen was guided toward the largest tent, while Kael was told to wait outside. He stood in the snow, the cold biting through his clothes, and listened to the low voices inside. Though he could not make out the words, the tone was clear. Arguments, distrust, and perhaps betrayal. When the Queen emerged, her face was unreadable. She told him they would stay here for the night, but her voice carried an edge he had not heard before. Kael knew something had changed in the camp's air, and whatever it was, it would not work in his favor. The night in the camp was colder than the mountain wind outside. Kael sat by a small fire at the camp's edge, feeling the eyes of the soldiers on him. Every glance carried suspicion, and every whisper stopped when he looked their way. The Queen remained in the large tent, speaking with the leaders of the camp. The child stayed close to her, not once leaving her side. When the meeting ended, the Queen emerged with a composed face. She walked to Kael and told him they would rest here until morning. Her voice was calm, but her eyes held a shadow of unease. He could tell she was guarding her words, as if the wrong sentence could spark something dangerous. Kael ate little of the food offered to him. He noticed the soldiers never ate until he had finished, and the way they passed glances between themselves made his instincts sharpen. In the mines he had seen this kind of silence before. It was the silence that came before a knife in the dark. Later, while tending to the sled, Kael overheard two soldiers talking in low voices. They spoke in the Queen's language, but he caught one word repeated with venom: slave. The tone told him enough. Whatever orders the Queen had given, these men did not see him as worthy of standing beside her. The Queen approached as if sensing his thoughts. She asked quietly if anyone had spoken to him in disrespect. Kael only said he could hear when he was not wanted. For a moment, her expression softened, but it hardened again when she glanced toward the other soldiers. Her trust in him was clear, but her control over them was uncertain. As the night deepened, the camp grew quiet. Kael took the first watch without being asked, sitting by the fire with his blade across his knees. He did not sleep, knowing danger could come from within as easily as from the wilderness outside. Snowflakes drifted down, hissing softly as they touched the flames. Near midnight, he heard movement behind him. Slow, deliberate footsteps pressed into the snow. Kael rose without turning, letting his hand rest on his weapon. A soldier's voice spoke, telling him to leave the Queen and the child in their care. The words carried the threat of what would happen if he refused. Kael turned, meeting the soldier's gaze with steady eyes. He asked what would happen to the Queen if he walked away. The soldier smirked but said nothing, only tapping the hilt of his weapon. That silence told Kael everything he needed to know. He stepped forward, closing the space between them until they stood face to face. The tension broke when the soldier's hand went to his blade. Kael moved faster, striking the man's wrist and sending the weapon clattering into the snow. The soldier staggered back, and Kael's voice was low but firm, warning that the next move would be his last if he threatened her again. The sound of the struggle brought the queen from her tent. She looked from Kael to the soldier and demanded an explanation. The soldier claimed Kael had attacked without reason. Kael stood silent, letting her choose whom to believe. Her gaze moved between them, and then she ordered the soldier to stand down and leave the fire. The man obeyed, though his glare promised the matter was not finished. The queen stepped closer to Kael, lowering her voice so only he could hear. She told him that not all in her ranks were loyal, and some saw her survival as a threat to their own power. Her warning was clear. The danger was as much political as it was physical. Kael nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. He had lived under masters who smiled while planning betrayal, and he knew the signs. If the queen's life was in danger from her own people, then his role was more than that of a simple protector. It was survival for both of them. The queen returned to her tent with the child, leaving Kael by the fire. The cold crept into his bones, but he stayed awake, watching every shadow. The soldiers kept their distance, but he knew this was not over. When morning came, they would have to move again, and this time, trust would be tested more than ever. Morning came with a pale sun casting long shadows over the camp. Kael rose early, packing the sled and checking the harness. The queen emerged from her tent with the child, her expression composed but her eyes scanning the camp. The soldiers moved about their duties, yet Kael could feel the undercurrent of tension like a current beneath ice. The queen told him they would travel further into the mountains to reach a fortified stronghold. It would be safer than the open camps, but the journey would be long. Kael nodded and took the lead, pulling the sled toward the narrow path that wound away from the camp. The soldiers followed behind, their footsteps crunching in the snow. As they moved, Kael noticed that 2 of the soldiers were missing. He asked the queen if they had left on patrol, but she gave no answer. Her silence told him she either did not know or chose not to say. That unease tightened in his chest, making him scan the ridges and shadows more often. Hours into the march, the wind began to rise, carrying with it a strange sound. It was not the roar of a beast nor the howl of the storm. It was a sharp, cutting whistle, like arrows splitting the air. Kael turned just as one struck the snow beside him, the black shaft quivering where it landed. Chaos erupted. From the rocks above, figures in dark armor appeared, releasing a volley of arrows. The soldiers with the queen scrambled for cover, shouting in their language. Kael moved to shield the sled, pulling it toward the cover of a fallen tree. The queen's voice rang out, commanding her troops to hold their ground. 2 of the queen's soldiers broke formation, rushing toward the attackers with reckless speed. Kael's eyes narrowed as he realized their charge left her exposed. He moved to her side, blocking another arrow with the sled's frame. The child clung to her arm, eyes wide with terror. The enemy pressed harder, forcing Kael and the queen to retreat behind the rocks. Snow sprayed around them as arrows and stones struck the ground. Kael's breath came in sharp bursts, but his focus never left her safety. The soldiers fought fiercely, yet the attackers' numbers kept growing. Then Kael saw them, the 2 missing soldiers from the camp, standing among the enemy ranks. Their armor was the same, but their loyalty had shifted. Betrayal burned in his mind, and he understood why the queen's gaze had carried warning days before. These men had led the enemy to them. Kael shouted the truth to her, and he saw in her eyes that she had suspected it. Her jaw tightened, but her voice stayed steady as she ordered him to get the sled moving. The path ahead was narrow, yet it was their only chance. He obeyed, dragging the sled through the snow while the soldiers fought to cover them. The attackers followed, their boots pounding against the ice. Kael's muscles screamed, but he pushed forward, pulling the queen and the child toward safety. The wind whipped around them, carrying the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded. Every step felt like a battle of its own. A sharp cry behind them made Kael glance back. One of the loyal soldiers had fallen, struck down by a traitor's Blade, the queen's face tightened, but she did not falter. She urged Kael onward, her hand gripping the sled as if willing it to move faster. The child's small voice whispered something, but the wind stole the words away. They reached a steep slope where the snow was loose and treacherous. Kael guided the sled down carefully, using his weight to slow their descent. Behind them, the attackers struggled to follow, their footing slipping on the icy ground. For a brief moment, distance grew between them and their pursuers. At the base of the slope, Kael found a narrow passage between two cliffs. The shadows here were deep, and the wind was muted. He led the sled through, the queen glancing over her shoulder to watch for movement. When no sound followed them, Kael allowed himself a single breath of relief, but he knew it was not over. The traitors had made their move, and the enemy now knew exactly where they were headed. If they were to reach the stronghold alive, they would have to be ready for the final confrontation that awaited them in the mountains. The narrow cliff passage opened into a wide plateau covered in snow. Beyond it, Kael could see the jagged walls of the stronghold rising from the mountainside. The stone towers stood like frozen sentinels, their banners snapping in the wind. It was their destination, but the open ground between them was dangerous. To cross, the queen studied the distance and told Kael they would have to move quickly. She explained that the stronghold guards would not open the gates unless they were certain of her identity. That meant she would need to be visible, but it also meant their enemies could see her too. Kael tightened his grip on the sled's rope. Ready to move, they stepped onto the open snow, the crunch of their boots loud in the empty air. Kael scanned the ridges above, expecting arrows or worse. The child clung to the queen's arm, their small face half hidden beneath the furs. The wind carried the faint sound of movement, and Kael's instincts sharpened. From the cliffs, figures appeared, the same traitorous soldiers and their dark armored allies. They moved fast, fanning out to cut off escape. Kael pulled the sled faster, his muscles straining, while the queen raised her voice to call toward the stronghold. Her words echoed across the plateau like a command to the mountains themselves. The enemy charged. Snow sprayed beneath their boots as they closed in. Kael turned sharply, placing himself between the queen and the attackers. His blade flashed in the cold light, striking down the first man who came too close. The queen's voice carried again, urging him forward, telling him they were almost there. Arrows hissed past, one grazing Kael's shoulder. Pain burned, but he did not slow. Another attacker leaped toward the sled, reaching for the queen. Kael's arm shot out, driving his blade into the man's chest before he could touch her. The child cried out, but the queen's hand steadied them. They reached the shadow of the stronghold walls. From above, the great gates began to open, the sound of grinding stone echoing across the plateau. The defenders shouted as they saw the queen, their weapons ready. Kael's heart pounded as he pushed for the last stretch, the roar of pursuit closing behind them. The traitors made one final rush, desperate to reach her before she entered the safety of the gates. Kael turned, meeting them head-on. Steel clashed in the snow, his every strike fueled by the thought that if he fell, she would fall too. The queen's voice cut through the chaos, commanding him to join her. With a final push, Kael broke free and pulled the sled through the gates. The heavy stone doors closed behind them with a deep, echoing thud. Inside, the air was filled with the shouts of guards and the clatter of weapons. The queen ordered the defenders to prepare for pursuit, her authority filling the courtyard. Kael stood in the shadow of the wall, breathing hard. Blood ran down his arm, but he stayed upright. The queen approached, her golden eyes locked on him. She told him that he had done more than save her life. He had preserved her claim to the throne. Her voice was steady, but there was something deeper beneath it. In front of the stronghold guards, she declared Kael no longer a slave. She said his loyalty had been proven beyond doubt, and his courage was unmatched by any soldier she commanded. The child smiled through their exhaustion, and the murmurs of the crowd carried a note of respect that had not been there before. Kael bowed his head slightly, unsure what to say. The queen stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. She told him that a debt such as his could not be repaid with gold or titles. Instead, she offered him a place at her side as her protector and equal, for as long as he chose to stay. Kael looked at her, then at the stronghold walls towering above them. He knew his life had changed forever. No chains bound him now, only the choice he made in his own heart. And in that moment, he chose to stay by her side, no longer as a slave, but as something far greater.